She spent 17 years waiting for a day she swore would never come, the day the state would take her life. Her name was Frances Newton, and when she faced that final moment, she still claimed she was innocent. But how did a young mother from Houston end up labeled one of the most cold-blooded killers in Texas history? And what if the truth behind her case wasn't what the world was told? Because this story isn't just about guilt or innocence, it's about doubt, and a justice system that may have made a fatal mistake. Before you decide what to believe, let's go back to where it all began. Frances Elaine Newton was born in Houston, Texas, in the spring of 1965, a time when the world around her was changing fast, but not always for the better. She grew up in a working-class black family, where every small victory came with a fight, and every dream seemed just out of reach. People who knew her back then described her as quiet, thoughtful, the kind of girl who tried to stay out of trouble, even when life didn't make that easy. But by the time she was 13, her life had already taken a turn she never saw coming. That's when she met Adrian Newton, a 15-year-old kid from the neighborhood. He was street smart, bold, and already living the kind of life most teens only heard about in whispers. Some said he had a dangerous side, but to Frances, he was charming, protective even. 2 years later, Frances became pregnant. She was just 15. The news hit her family hard. Her parents were disappointed, worried, but Frances was determined to make it work. She gave birth to a baby boy, Alton Jared Newton, and for a while, that little boy became her reason to fight through everything. She wanted stability, a family, a normal life. But life with Adrian would prove to be anything but normal. By her early 20s, the two were married, still young, still trying to figure out who they were. And behind closed doors, cracks had already begun to show. Adrian had one foot in the streets, one in his home, and Frances found herself caught between the man she loved and the chaos he brought with him. The love that once held them together was starting to fall apart. And soon, their home would become the scene of something far darker than anyone could have imagined. By the mid-1980s, Frances and Adrian's marriage was hanging by a thread. What had started as a young love story was now buried under jealousy, resentment, and survival. Adrian's world had grown darker. He was deep in the streets, dealing, using, and owing money to the wrong people. Frances knew it, but she tried to keep her distance, focusing on her children, trying to build a normal life inside a home that no longer felt safe. Neighbors would later say that the tension between the two was impossible to ignore. Arguments that started small would spiral fast, sometimes about money, sometimes about other women. Both had secrets, both were angry, and their home in Houston became less a place of love, and more like a battlefield. Frances was barely getting by. She worked small jobs to keep food on the table, raising her 2 kids almost on her own. Meanwhile, Adrian was slipping further into danger, owing thousands to dealers, with rumors spreading that someone was coming to collect. At night, Frances would sometimes find him hiding under the bed, terrified that someone was outside waiting for him. The fear in that house was real, and it was growing. She wanted out, but didn't know how. Every choice seemed like the wrong one. Every argument could explode at any moment. And that's when Frances made a decision she thought would protect her family. A decision that would later become the centerpiece of a murder trial, and the reason the world would remember her name. In March of 1987, with bills piling up and her marriage collapsing, Frances made a choice that would change the rest of her life. She decided to take out life insurance policies, one for her husband Adrian, one for her son Alton, and one for her baby daughter, Farah. Her cousin, Frederick Wilson, worked as an insurance agent. He helped her set up 3 policies worth a total of $100,000. A lot of money for a family that barely had enough to make rent. But to make those policies official, she needed Adrian's signature. And when he refused to sign, Frances did it herself. She later said she forged his name just to avoid another fight, that she didn't want him questioning why she was spending money they didn't have. But when investigators would later discover that forgery, it would become a key piece of evidence, one that prosecutors said revealed her true motive. At the time, no one thought much of it. To her friends, Frances seemed like a woman trying to protect her family, even if she bent a few rules to do it. But others saw it differently. They saw a plan, one that looked like it was set in motion long before the tragedy even began. Because within just 3 weeks of signing those policies, everyone covered by them would be gone. And on a warm April evening in Houston, the life Frances Newton was trying to hold together would shatter in the most horrifying way imaginable. April 7, 1987. It started like any other day in the Newton household, but by nightfall, 3 lives would be gone. Frances came home from work sometime after 5:30 p.m. Her husband, Adrian, was already there, tired, restless, and on edge. He'd told his girlfriend earlier that day that something felt off, that Frances seemed different. He said he couldn't relax until she left for work. When she walked through the door that evening, Frances greeted her children like she always did. She hugged her son, kissed her baby girl, and played with them for a few moments, small, ordinary gestures that would later feel almost haunting. Then, she asked Adrian's brother, Sterling, who lived with them, to step out for a bit. She said she wanted to talk to Adrian about their marriage. Sterling hesitated, but eventually left. It would be the last time anyone saw Adrian, Alton, and Farah alive. Sometime between 6 and 6:30 p.m., neighbors reported hearing a single sharp sound, then silence. When Sterling returned about an hour later with Frances, what he found inside the apartment would scar him forever. Adrian was slumped on the couch, a single gunshot wound to the head. In the bedrooms, both children lay still. No signs of forced entry. No struggle. Whoever had done this, the victims had trusted them completely. Frances collapsed, screaming, sobbing uncontrollably. To some, it was the sound of a mother whose entire world had just been destroyed. To others, it was an act, the performance of a woman who had everything to gain. But what happened next only deepened the mystery. Instead of calling the police right away, Frances went to see her cousin, Sandra. Together, they walked to an abandoned house nearby, one that belonged to her parents. There, Frances quietly hid a blue bag inside. Inside that bag was a .25 caliber pistol, the same weapon that would later be identified as the murder gun. When police arrived, Frances was hysterical, crying, shaking. She insisted she had no idea who could have done it. But once detectives found that hidden gun, their suspicions shifted instantly. The case was no longer about grief. It was about guilt. From the start, investigators believed the case was clear-cut. A hidden gun, a forged insurance policy, a woman with everything to gain. To them, the puzzle pieces fit too perfectly to ignore. The .25 caliber pistol found in that blue bag was tested, and ballistics matched it to the bullets recovered from the victims. Or at least, that's what the official report said. Frances told police she had hidden the gun because she was afraid Adrian might use it against someone he owed money to. She claimed she'd only found it earlier that day and didn't want it in the house. To detectives, that sounded like an excuse. To Frances, it was the truth that no one wanted to believe. But cracks in the case began to appear almost immediately. Forensic experts found traces of nitrites on the lower part of Frances's skirt, chemicals that can show up after a gun is fired. Yet those same traces can also appear when someone is simply near a gun when it's discharged. In other words, the test didn't prove she pulled the trigger, only that she might have been close when it happened. Then came the real problem, the ballistics. Years later, independent investigators discovered that the shell casings found at the scene didn't match the pistol prosecutors claimed was the murder weapon. That detail, never brought up at trial, could have changed everything. It was the kind of evidence that might have raised reasonable doubt, but by the time it came to light, Frances had already spent years waiting on death row. Even the chain of custody for the gun was confusing. Reports mentioned a second weapon, one that seemed to disappear from the official record. Had there been another shooter? Another gun? Or was it simply sloppy police work? No one could say for sure. But the deeper her defense team looked, the more they uncovered a case built on assumptions, contradictions, and unanswered questions. Still, the prosecution had what they needed: motive, opportunity, and a weapon that seemed to tell its own story. And with that, Frances Newton was headed to trial. A trial that would decide whether she was a grieving mother, or a calculating killer. When Frances Newton walked into the courtroom in October 1988, she was just 23 years old. Behind her was a story of loss, doubt, and tragedy. In front of her, 12 jurors, a death sentence waiting to be written, and a public already convinced she was guilty. The prosecution's case was simple, almost too simple. They said Frances was desperate for money, trapped in a failing marriage, and saw the life insurance policies as her way out. They painted her as a cold, calculating woman who forged documents, hid the gun, and murdered her family for a payout that never even came. Their evidence sounded convincing, until you looked closer. The inconsistencies, the missing gun reports, the unexplained shell casings. None of it seemed to matter once the narrative had been set. In the eyes of the state, Frances wasn't a young mother fighting to survive. She was a liar who had planned it all. Her defense team, underfunded and underprepared, struggled to counter the state's story. They argued that the investigation was rushed, that crucial details were ignored, and that someone tied to Adrian's drug debts might have been responsible. But without hard proof or new witnesses, their words carried little weight. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Their verdict was unanimous. Guilty of capital murder for killing more than one person in the same act. And just like that, the sentence was set: death by lethal injection. Frances showed little emotion as the decision was read. Some said she looked cold, others said she looked broken, but no one in that room could have guessed that her case would become one of the most controversial in Texas history. Because while the jury believed they had heard the full story, the truth was far from over. In the years that followed, new evidence, missing records, and ignored witnesses would begin to surface, each one raising a single haunting question: had Texas just sentenced an innocent woman to die? After the verdict, Frances Newton was transferred to death row in Huntsville, Texas, a concrete world of locked doors, quiet corridors, and time that never seemed to move. She was 23 years old, with nothing left but her voice, and even that was fading with every year that passed. For nearly 17 years, Frances sat in a small cell, writing letters to anyone who would listen. To her parents, to activists, to strangers who believed something about her case just didn't add up. And through it all, she never changed her story. She said she did not kill her husband. She said she did not kill her children. Outside those prison walls, her case refused to die. Human rights groups like Amnesty International began calling for a new investigation. Legal teams dug up the same questions the jury had never heard: the mismatched shell casings, the second gun, the possibility that someone connected to Adrian's drug debts might have been responsible. Frances even spoke in interviews, describing how her husband's life had spiraled before his death. He owed money to someone dangerous, she said. That man wasn't imaginary, he was real, and my husband was terrified. Those words echoed through every appeal that followed, but none of them stopped what was already in motion. The state held firm. The courts denied motion after motion, each one shorter than the last. The years slipped away, and so did hope. Yet through it all, those who met Frances in prison said she remained calm, even kind. She taught Bible study. She wrote poetry. She smiled when her parents came to visit, even as the clock above her head kept ticking closer to zero. By 2005, the case of Frances Newton had become more than a criminal trial, it was a symbol. To some, she was a murderer who'd finally face justice. To others, she was proof that the system could destroy an innocent woman and call it law. And as the date of her execution approached, one thing became clear. Frances Elaine Newton wasn't going to beg for mercy. She was going to face the end the same way she'd faced every day since the verdict. Quietly, defiantly, and still claiming she was innocent. It was the evening of September 14, 2005, in Huntsville, Texas. The air was warm and heavy, carrying the weight of a story that had haunted the state for nearly 2 decades. At 6:09 p.m., Frances Elaine Newton was led into the execution chamber. The gurney awaited her, straps in place, IV lines ready to deliver the lethal chemicals. Behind the glass, family members of the victims, journalists, activists, and Frances's own parents watched silently. When asked if she had any last words, she shook her head. No, she refused a final meal, a gesture many saw as a quiet protest, a refusal to participate in a ritual that declared her guilty in the eyes of the state. The injection began. She turned her head slightly toward the glass, almost as if searching for someone in the crowd. Her lips parted, as though she wanted to speak, but the drugs had already started to take hold. She coughed once, took a deep breath, and then her eyes slowly closed. At 6:17 p.m., Frances Elaine Newton was pronounced dead. Outside, protesters sang "Amazing Grace" as the news spread across the country. Some saw justice done, others saw a system that had failed a woman who had spent 17 years insisting she was innocent. She was the third woman executed in Texas since 1982, and only the 11th woman executed in the United States since 1976. And yet, for those who followed her story closely, the final question remained unanswered. Was Frances Newton a cold-blooded killer, or an innocent woman whose life was taken before the truth could ever fully emerge? Even now, the debate continues, leaving a shadow over one of the most controversial cases in American history. Frances Elaine Newton's story didn't end in the courtroom or the execution chamber. It lives on in the unanswered questions, the contradictions in the evidence, and the doubts that still linger in the minds of those who followed her case. Was she a desperate mother pushed to the edge, or a calculated killer who planned every move? Did the justice system get it right, or did it make a tragic mistake that could never be undone? 17 years on death row, letters pleading her innocence, new evidence never considered. All of it raises a single, haunting thought. Do we truly know the truth about what happened that night in Houston? Some will say yes, others will never stop wondering. And maybe that's the real story, a life, a death, and a mystery that refuses to let go. The question remains, what do you believe?